Hey guys, my name is Nathan and welcome to another Q&A where we answer your questions about the Bible, the church, or anything that you want to know. Let's look at today's question. How can I grow my faith? And I have to say, as a pastor, this is the question that I get the most. I mean, who wouldn't want to grow their faith? And I would say if you're taking your time out of today to watch this video, I'm guessing you would probably say, yeah, I would like for my faith to grow too. So to answer this question, traditionally we list things like read your Bible, pray, attend church, serve others, and those type of things. And really, those are all great pieces. But today, I want to approach this from a different angle. One that I would guess will be relevant to most of us right here and right now. Let's go to the book of James. That James has a unique perspective on how to grow closer to God. One that is probably harder than anything off of the pray and read your Bible list. Because this is what James says in James chapter 1. Count it all joy, dear brothers and sisters, when trouble of any kind comes your way. This has to be one of the least popular verses in the entire Bible. It's a verse that tends to get abused and lumped in with other verses like Romans 8:28, that we know God causes everything to work together for good for those who love God. It's verses like these that are usually in the, I know that your life stinks, so here's a bumper sticker idea taken out of context that doesn't make you feel any better, but it makes me feel better that I gave you a Bible verse type of ideas. And I completely get it. Verse 2 seems completely counterintuitive when taken out of context. I mean, why should we consider the troubles that come in our lives a joy? Well, we find out in the next verse. For you know that when your faith is tested, your endurance has a chance to grow. So let it grow. For when your endurance is fully developed, you will be perfect and complete, needing nothing. Now we're getting somewhere. Let's take the steps in these verses. Step 1. When trouble comes, our faith is tested. Which leads us to step 2. Because when our faith is tested, our endurance has a chance to grow our faith. Okay, so far this makes sense. The way to grow in pretty much anything is to practice it. That's how you grow in sports or education or relationships or anything really. You grow in it because you work at it. And your faith is pretty much the same. That it gets exercised when things get tough. Which means that when we have struggles, it gives our faith the greatest opportunity to grow. We all said at the beginning, hey, we'd love for our faith to flourish. But therefore, we need these troubles to test our faith, to grow our endurance. Which means now we can move on to the natural conclusion of step 3. That therefore, we should be able to count trouble as joy because it gives us exactly what we all want, the chance to grow in our faith. It's so simple, yet also so difficult. But James isn't done yet. He's taken some logical steps to increasing our faith, but he knows that times of trouble can be tough. So how do we handle it? How do we handle these confusing and stressful issues that well up in our lives? Well, James addresses that in verse 5. If you need wisdom, just ask. Ask our generous God and he will give it to you. He's not going to rebuke you for asking. And that's perfect. That James tells us that when we're confused, when we need wisdom on what to do, we should, and this will sound familiar to you, pray about it and do what God says. I mean, that's exactly what James gives us as an answer. But then he takes it even further in verse 6. That when you ask God, be sure that your faith is in God and God alone. Don't waver. For a person with divided loyalty is as unsettled as the waves of the sea. They're blown about and tossed by the wind. And such people shouldn't expect to receive anything from the Lord, because their loyalty is divided between God and the world, and they're unstable in everything that they do. And these verses are really James just doubling down on pray about it and do what God says. Because James is saying, guys, you can't pray about this and then just do whatever you want, because that's not how it works. You pray about it and then you do what God says. Then if you're going to pray about it and then not do what God says, you may be worse off than when you started, because you're both now trying to follow the world and you're trying to follow God instead of choosing one or the other. I mean, you're kind of in this no man's land. So if you're going to pray about it, then you need to be prepared to do what God says, whether you think it's a good idea or not. And at this point, you might be thinking, okay, sounds great, like the idea, but can you give me an example of exactly how I could count everything joy? Well, fortunately, I can, because James gives us an example using something that we all deal with in our lives every single day. Money. Verse 9, believers who are poor, they have something to boast about, for God has honored them, and those who are rich should boast that God has humbled them. James says that we can count it joy no matter what we have. In our society, being poor is pretty much the worst thing in the world. But James says we can celebrate if we're poor, because God has honored them. In fact, the poor were the very first group blessed in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, that God blesses those who are poor and realize their need for Him, for the kingdom of heaven is theirs. So the poor have something to count as joy, that their reliance on God is greater. But the rich aren't left out either, because if in our society being poor is the worst thing, being rich is considered the best. I mean, it's the American dream, for crying out loud. I mean, the rich are the envy of most, which can lead to this buildup of pride very quickly. The rich see their need for God become less and less because financially, they can do it all themselves. So James points out where their joy comes from. It comes from humility, not being full of themselves, but being full of God. Not being stingy, but being generous. Not making money their God, but keeping God as God. And it's a real challenge, which is why more people struggle with finding God in wealth than they do finding God in poverty. And money is a great example because it affects all of us so directly. But let's go back to James 2 and remember that finding joy doesn't just count for money. It counts for everything in our lives. Count it all joy when trouble of any kind comes your way. And that's it. We count it all joy. This verse doesn't say, well, count some of it joy. It doesn't say, count it joy when you feel like it. And it definitely does not say, count it all joy when times are good. No, we count it all joy. But do we do that? And many of us are struggling these days. And is it because that we forgot to count it all joy? Is the negativity and the uncertainty of everything swirling around us causing us to lose a golden opportunity to grow closer to God? Are we viewing things as a trial to begrudgingly endure instead of a trial that gets to increase our faith? I mean, we all said at the beginning, we'd love to increase our faith. But a key part of that is counting our troubles joy. So the question that I want to close with is this. When you look back over your last week, you look back over your last month, have you been counting it all joy?